The Endurance Asia podcast.
And always tell a truthful story if they ever ask. Stop the complaining cause things ain't that bad.
Ben, Jim, welcome to the Endurance Asia podcast.
Thanks for having us, man.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, in fact, actually, I say welcome, and I'm sitting in your testing laboratory here with the gents from Coached, Ben Pulham and James Webster, Jim. So I'm really excited to sit down with you guys because I was actually first sort of made aware of you guys a few years ago. I was speaking to a friend about VO2 max testing, and he was like, come and speak to these guys about doing some testing. And just, we met in a coffee shop, and you just completely opened up the whole new world of, I suppose, like the depth of analysis you can go into with endurance sports. And yeah, it led to sort of me coming and meeting with you guys. And I think I've been through 3 testing with you, but you started off with VO2 max testing is like kind of a waste of time. It's a vanity test, but yeah, led into quite a few other sort of tests that we've been through over the years. But yeah, like firstly, Ben, Jim, if you want to introduce yourselves and just sort of like give a bit about your background and how you got to here.
Sure, man. So my background's in triathlon. I was fortunate to spend a good chunk of years in the early 2000s racing as a professional triathlete. Represented New Zealand at the World Cup Series, which is at the time the highest level of the sport. Now they have the World Championship Series. And then 2007...
Yeah, what year was that?
My last year was in 2007. So from about 2000 to 2007, I was full-time. The last 5 of those as a legit professional, meaning I earned more than I spent. And I raced, I'd be what I call a second-tier pro. Like I was in the races with all the top guys, but I was the guy making up the numbers back in, 20th to 30th position.
Yeah, which in the best of the world is still pretty impressive, though.
Well, I mean, I was decent, I don't think I reached my potential. I did the Olympic trials in Beijing in 2007. Then I had to come to Singapore to run a 10K here for one of my sponsors. And that morning I woke up in absolute agony. Like I literally thought I was dying. And it turned out I had a really severe strain of dengue fever.
You're kidding?
Yeah, man. So
you picked up in Singapore?
Yeah, I must have got bitten by a mosquito a few days before the race, and then woke up the morning of the race just in absolute suffering.
Did you still race?
No.
I was going to say.
Mate, I couldn't get out of bed. Like, I couldn't move. I was in bed for 6 months.
Wow.
Like, I literally just, it smashed me. And I think, too, because I'd come off the Olympic trials, I was so lean. Like, I'm so fat now compared to what I was at that point, right? And
yeah.
I just think when you're training at that level, like, often your immune system is on the verge of...
Yeah.
It's so suppressed. It's on the verge of being sick all the time. And then when you get something like that, like, I just don't think I had anything to fight.
So you reckon did that actually like retire you then? I suppose 6 months.
I say
out,
it did, but in hindsight, looking back, I could have come back. It's just my coach, who was a doctor, he was looking at my bloods as well and saying, look, your immune system is fried. It's going to take a year to get your fitness back. Probably another year to really get back into good shape. By then they'll be running about another minute faster. You'll be 30. So I hope you come back. I support you to come back, but, you can think about what you want to do. And I gave it some thought, and my goals, like, I grew up watching Hamish Carter and Cameron Brown and all these guys who are famous New Zealand triathletes race, and they were racing the World Cup Series. They were sponsored by Nike. So that's what I wanted to do, and I was fortunate to do both of those. So I went, I sort of achieved my goals, so I'll look to do something else. And it's a hard way to make a living. Like, it's good fun, but it's pretty tough.
Yeah, and it's sort of, we'll sort of get you to intro in a second as well, Jim, but it does sort of beg the question about how good is endurance sports for you in terms of like, it can completely shatter your immune system, can't you? And there is a line as to the point where it's good for longevity, it's good for overall fitness, but it gets to the point where it can really sort of affect your overall well-being if you're pushing it too hard, right?
Definitely, man. I think that's one of the biggest learnings for me, having moved from racing as a professional to now being so heavily involved with the testing and seeing what effects different types of training and nutrition and sleep and things have on your metabolic function and how you clear lactate and some other things. And I think to a point, some aerobic training is obviously very beneficial.
Yeah.
But for the people that take it to the extreme, like what I was and probably what you're doing, I wouldn't say that it's good for you.
Yeah. We were talking about Jim and I were talking about watching the Iron Cowboy, the 50 Ironmans, 50 days,
yeah.
50 states. But yeah, the lack of sleep and everything there. I wonder how it would took him a year or two to recover, I'm sure. But yeah, Jim, what's your background, sir?
Oh, well, I don't know how I can follow Ben. I'm by no means an elite athlete, that's for sure. But no, my background, I'm the sports scientist here at Coach. So I've now been in Singapore a year and now 9 months, right? Wow. Yeah. And so, before that, I come from the UK, studied at Exeter University, doing my sports science degree. Always been interested in sport myself, dabbled in motorsport as I went through my teens. But, since moving here, typically I was very fortunate to meet Ben quite early on and kind of operate his lab. So I'm not an elite athlete by any means, but I'm interested in running and I take part every now and then. So
yeah, you're the scientist amongst us, and that segues quite nicely onto both Rick and I have been through some testing quite recently with you guys. We planned to do it as like a guinea pig thing, doing a before and after. That
would have been nice.
It would have been nice to do that because Rick did. We were going to use Rick as a guinea pig to then sort of maybe change his diet, go on a training block, and soon after it he got hand, foot, and mouth after and so his whole training went to pot. But still, it'll be good to sort of discuss the testing we went through and why, and then the kind of results and really sort of, I suppose, advice to listeners on why they should do it and what are the sort of things that you would be looking to get out of the kind of testing that we went through.
Sure. Well, just to rewind back a little bit, the reason we opened the lab in the first place was because back when I was racing pro, one of the perks, I guess you could call it, was you could go into the different institutes around the place, plug yourself into some machines, look at really what's going on inside your body, and then based on those results, optimize to improve your training, your nutrition, your lifestyle habits, so that you can hopefully win some more money, get some better results, right?
Yeah.
When I first moved to Singapore, I wanted to get a test done for one of the first athletes I started coaching, and I realized I couldn't do it. There was no place that I could find that offered lactate testing. So even though I'm not a sports scientist, I thought, well, I understand the applied side very well because I've done tons of these tests. And so I partnered up with a sports scientist, and that's sort of how we started out. And then things have evolved. So the two tests we took you through, one was a lactate test. That's the one I used to do a lot when I was an athlete. And that's basically just a fitness test. The second one, which is the one that I think is pretty interesting, is what we call a fuel efficiency test, which is essentially a metabolic test. And it's looking at how you're preferencing your energy at different intensities. Yeah. So over the last 12 years that I've been here, I've become a very big advocate for becoming a fat burner. Yeah. One of the last conversations I had with my coach back in 2006, I think it was, he was saying, I wonder if we could make you better at burning fat, because if we could, you would conserve glycogen and you'd be able to race at a higher output with less reliance on the external fuels, so less gut issues and stuff that comes with that.
Yeah.
And then nothing really came of that because I got sick and sort of wound it up. Then in 2008, when I moved here and we were looking to buy a VO2 Max machine, an off comment by the salesperson was like, oh, and it has a fat burning software. And so I bought it exclusively for the fat burning software, and I had no idea whether or not you could change a person's fat burning, but it turns out you can, right?
Yeah. I remember you telling me the story actually of picking up a book called WTF, What the Fat, and reading about the nutritionist in there actually used to be your nutritionist in New Zealand, right?
That's right, man.
And she wrote a book about the benefits of a healthy fat diet over a sort of carb loading diet, and you were like, hey, this isn't what you told me before, right? Exactly,
man. So when I came to Singapore, what was interesting is because I'd gone from this obscene amount of training, I was doing anywhere between 20 and 30 hours a week probably, to nothing. I started putting on weight. I didn't get fat because I was insanely lean, but as the owner of a new fitness company, putting on weight is not a good start. And so it coincided at the same time as we got this metabolic testing stuff. So I thought, okay, cool, guinea pig time. So I jumped on the machine, started doing some testing on myself and, my parents and friends and family and whatnot, and started reading. I was just Googling, can you improve fat metabolism? And then started reading, and turns out you can. Yeah. And so the first book I ever read was a book called Why We Get Fat. And that's by a guy called Gary Taubes, and he talks about insulin, and that was sort of my first introduction to insulin and why having too much of that inhibits fat burning. And from there, like I kept playing with it, and we started to refine our protocols and to really see that you can improve someone significantly. So 2 or 3 years after that, I was sitting in New Zealand around a coffee table, catching up with one of my old coaches, and sticking out on the coffee table was the What the Fat book. And it had a big, I think from memory, there's a frying pan with a big bit of butter in it. And it just caught my attention because that's what I've been telling people here, right? Like, limit the carbs, up the healthy fats. Saturated fats are not the enemy. And so I pulled this book out just to have a look. And then at the bottom, the author caught my eye. So it's a lady, one of the authors, there's 3 authors. One of the authors is a lady called Karen Zinn. And she was one of my dietitians when I was racing, and she'd always told me to eat a high-carb, low-fat diet. And so I called her up and said, Karen, it sounds like you owe me a coffee. And we went and met up at the university where she works in Auckland, and we just had a chat. And it turned out that the co-author of the book is a guy called Grant Schofield, who was also a long-course professional triathlete in New Zealand. I didn't know him at the time, but I knew of him. But he's a professor of public health. And so one of the big issues that he's facing in his role is diabetes. Yeah. And so he brought the question to Karen a few years ago, if diabetes is a function of insulin, why are we recommending a diet that promotes a high insulin response? And she was like, that's a good question. And so then they started diving down the rabbit hole of research that's been done all around the world back into the 50s, and started to realize that things had gone awry, and that what we thought we knew about nutrition was not quite right. On the flip side,
famous research done around the sugar, that was financed by the sugar industry, right? That demonized saturated fat as the cause for heart disease.
Unfortunately, yeah. And on the flip side too, they have access to a lab like this at the university. So I believe they were doing a lot of the same sort of testing that we're doing, and they just saw for themselves, like we have, that the carbs, especially the processed and starchy carbs, inhibiting fat burning. And so they've gone out on a crusade to teach people about the benefits of a lower carb, healthy fat diet. And they've written this book called What the Fat, and a few others with a similar title. And they're doing really good things.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I suppose that it's considered like a fad diet, a keto diet, low carb, high fat, and it's got, as with any of these, like nutrition, and I'm really keen to get a nutritionist on the podcast, people can become very dogmatic about it, and it's like there's only one diet for everyone in the world,
it's
and
hilarious,
whether it be vegan, whether it be like a protein, high protein, whether it be keto, low carb, high fat, I mean, and
it's like politics and religion, mate. Everyone has an opinion, and it's all.
All you need to do is just jump on a Twitter feed and just put a handle in keto or something, and just see the sort of the differencing in views on it. But even in the sort of scientific world, there's a lady called Louise Burke in Australia that's been doing a lot of research around sort of professional athletes, and actually trying to work out whether it improves performance in the very highest level of elite athlete, and the findings aren't conclusive. One thing is for sure, though, that eating a high fat, low carb diet can help you reduce your body fat percentage. It can help you lose weight, whether that is through portion control, because you feel more satiated and you don't need to eat as much, because if you're eating high fat, you're less hungry. But it definitely is and reduces insulin resistance, and there's lots of studies to prove that. So overall health of your general well-being, or like general person and general populace, there's so much anecdotal evidence, and there's becoming more sort of like mass evidence to prove that it's good for people's health.
Yeah, and I think that's an important idea too, because a lot of people they look exclusively at performance, and a lot of the research studies, especially around the elite athletes, they are looking exclusively at performance, right? Now, that's fine if you're trying to win an Olympic gold medal, but if you're not, if you're like you with a family and a job and lots of things battling for your attention, my argument is that performance shouldn't be your only goal. When we create our coach programs, we're obviously going to make people better. That's why they pay us money. but we're not exclusively optimizing for performance. We're also optimizing for health.
Yeah.
And I think health and fitness are not the same thing. I used to think they were, but you can be very fit and very unhealthy.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important consideration when you read these types of studies and things as well.
Yeah. I mean, my advice to people on it, and I try not to be dogmatic, but it's like, just try it. Just go through, but it has to be like not just try it for 2 weeks. You have to invest in like a 3-month period to be able to truly see, because there's a certain adaptation period when you change your diet to be able to get used to burning the fat.
And I think that's part of the problem. Like a lot of people half-ass things.
Yeah.
And so they half-ass it. They go, oh, well, it didn't work properly, or I had cravings still, or whatever. And I'm like, it's not a fair test. Like if someone really goes down the rabbit hole and does the protocols properly and tries it properly, like more often than not, it will have some benefit.
Yeah. But I mean, as we talk about performance, like so the test that you do for the fuel efficiency, if you could just explain about how the fuel efficiency test works, Jim.
Yes. So the fuel efficiency test, the main protocol is what we call a ramp test. So the aim of the game is to essentially get the individual to go from what we would class definitely as low intensity all the way up to high intensity. So we have a set duration of 20 minutes to achieve that. Okay, so the incline on the treadmill would be fixed. If it's on the bike, we would obviously have a wheel-on trainer. But the aim is to just slowly build up the resistance. Okay, so whilst the individual's doing that, we have them masked up and we have them hooked up to our metabolic cart here. And what we're essentially looking to establish is and analyze the respiratory exchange ratio between the oxygen they breathe in and the carbon dioxide they breathe out. Because by using that, we can typically dictate which fuel source their body's typically prioritizing, whether it be fat or carbohydrate.
And just to drill down on that, so the more, when you're breathing out carbohydrate, that's indicative of the amount of fat you're burning, or is it? Yeah, how does it?
Also, typically, fat as a fuel is very oxygen dependent.
Yeah.
So, in order for us to be able to oxidize it, we need to be operating where that's way more present than we emit CO2. So, under lower intensity, when we're training aerobically, that's where we'll commonly find you be able to maximize on being able to burn fat. It's only when you start to push the intensity and work harder that you start to see then that ratio change within your breathing, because we're working harder and the mechanisms are at play, and that's where sugar typically will then take over. And so,
but what is the actual machine testing for? Is it testing for the volume of carbohydrate you're still breathing out, or the volume of oxygen you're still breathing?
Oxygen and CO2, just per breath. Yeah, so it's looking at the ratio between the two.
Okay. Yeah. And if the ratio is high with the volume of carbohydrate you're breathing out, does that mean you're burning more?
You don't breathe out carbohydrate.
Yeah, it's by
you breathe
CO2.
Essentially, you breathe in oxygen.
Yep.
If your body's able to use it, you'll breathe out a higher percentage of carbon dioxide. That's a sign you're burning more fat.
Yeah. Sorry, I meant carbon dioxide.
Because what happens,
did I say carbon dioxide?
Yeah, I said carbohydrate.
Sorry, I meant carbon dioxide.
As you run faster, you puff, right? So the breathing becomes a little bit more shallow. So you're breathing in the oxygen, you're still using some of it, obviously, but you're breathing out a higher proportion of carbon dioxide.
Okay, but if you're burning glycogen, you'll be breathing out a higher proportion of oxygen as opposed to carbon dioxide.
Yeah, your breathing frequency naturally rises, right? Because you're trying to get as much oxygen in your system to sustain the supposed effort. So the issue is we naturally emit more CO2, which as a result just causes our body to switch its focus towards sugar, because it's a much faster acting fuel source and it helps us meet the demand of what you're undergoing. So you'll see as we go through the test, the ratio will gradually build and it will change to the point where we can then naturally see your body shifting and prioritizing way more sugar or carbohydrate.
Okay, and so for endurance sports, what is the ideal volume of both carbohydrate and fat burning at a certain intensity? What are the sort of what should people be aiming for?
I'd say it depends on more the activity, to be honest, because we have a range of different endurance athletes, whether you're a triathlete or if you're a runner. Typically the discipline you're going to undergo and where you're going to do that discipline will typically dictate. But the general rule of thumb is you want to try be as reliant on fat for fuel as you can. Someone who's deemed fat adapted can burn what would typically be determined as 60 grams per hour. So if you're able to get up to that sort of volume of a gram per minute, then you're doing well in terms of being able to metabolize fat. Yeah. In terms of carbohydrate, you essentially want to rely as little on it as possible. It's naturally going to take over. So where what we typically call a crossover point occur, we ideally want that to happen as close to what we call your lactate threshold. So you can basically operate and sustain the highest output you can before sugar and carbohydrate inevitably take over. Yeah. So
and that's an interesting point, because you're And I suppose the correlation between fuel efficiency and lactate threshold is quite important, because what's the amount of time you can maintain at your lactate threshold? Is it like an hour? Yeah, an hour.
Everyone's different. People who are well trained can sustain it a little more, but say an hour.
Yeah, and so if you're doing like a half marathon, I mean the elite level, they'll be doing an hour. That means that if they can burn purely fat at their lactate threshold, then they could run a half marathon at their lactate threshold pace without having to access their glycogen stores for the entire race, in theory.
Well, you'll find that at lactate threshold, there's usually a breakdown of the two. You're never going to be relying entirely on one fuel and reserving the other. That will only be happening around your easy zone, typically, right? But when you're at your lactate threshold, there's going to be a good concoction of the two.
Yeah, most people who come in here and do a test cannot burn any fat at their lactate threshold.
Yeah.
You're a rare
common,
exception.
Yeah.
So the goal is not to be completely anti-carb, but the idea is that if we can improve your metabolic health, have you burn more fat, you conserve glycogen. Now, the upside of that is you only store roughly 1,500 to 2,000 calories of glycogen in your muscles and your liver, and that's not much. That's probably a marathon pace, maybe 90 minutes, 2 hours worth of energy. Yeah. So if you're going to run more than that and you don't take anything in, you're going to hit the wall, right?
Yeah.
Or you're going to have to take in a lot of external fuel.
Yeah.
Now, if we can make you better at burning fat, you conserve that glycogen because you're burning a higher proportion of that total energy as fat and just a little bit of glycogen. And then as the intensity moves up, you burn less fat, more glycogen.
Yeah, and this is interesting when it comes to longer endurance sports. A lot of people have issues around taking fuel on while they're moving. They'll have like gastric issues. They can't like eat or get sick of gels. I'm sure like when you were training at a professional level, like I'm sure you got sick of goos at the bottom.
I never went as long as you did, man. I never raced more than a couple of hours, but I trained.
But your intensity would have been
my intensity was higher for sure. Yeah. But I think anytime your body's under stress, it will try and preserve. So when you're under stress in the end of an ultra or in an Ironman or something like that, like your digestive system is not essential. And so the blood that is usually flowing through there to help make it function pulls to other places like the heart, the muscles, the brain. Yeah. And what would normally work well and you should be able to digest doesn't work so well, and you start to end up having tummy issues. Yeah. And so, again, my argument is always like, if we can make you a better fat burner, you're less reliant on those external fuel sources. So instead of maybe having to have a gel every 30 minutes, you can have a gel every hour or every hour and a half, and that's enough to top up what you're losing because you're also generating energy from fat.
Yeah, you're tapping into your fat stores.
That's the idea.
Which in theory, your fat stores are effectively limitless. So if you're running a race in a day, it will, most people will carry sort of 10 to 20% of body fat. For normal elite athletes are down to sort of 4%, I suppose. But even at 4% body fat percentage,
you've still got all day energy.
Resource.
Yeah, like anywhere from 30 to 50,000 calories, give or take, of fuel readily available. So in terms of fat cells. So no matter how high or low your typical body fat percentage is, you typically have a good amount to tap into.
Yeah. So let's touch quickly on, so Rick and I have both been through the testing. So it would be good to sort of touch on the results from
you
the two of them.
You just want us to stroke your ego.
No.
You did good.
So these
good
guys
results.
are good fat burners. You guys are good fat burners, man. Your result in 12 years of doing this test, and I think we've done, I've been witness to over 8,000, is the best test the last one that you did, is the best test that I've seen.
Wow.
That's pretty impressive,
included.
mate. You, sorry if I just bring up your result again.
I wish that correlated to overall fitness and performance.
Like you're burning up to 90 grams an hour of fat. That's insane.
Based on what we tracked,
That's impressive. Just to give you perspective, an average person that comes through here will burn between 20 and 30 at best.
Yeah, sometimes 40.
You started about 75. You gradually build up to 90, and then you go all the way along to threshold. And even, I think when you get to about threshold, you're still at close to 60 grams.
And when you say threshold, that's lactate?
Lactate threshold.
Yeah.
So someone who can, like I say, metabolize fat very well, they can typically find that at lactate threshold, where lactate accumulates way more than we can clear, that's also where fat then turns off and sugar takes over, because they both correlate. So you're pretty much able to do that by the looks of things, by the data we collect.
And there's certain things that drive this, right? Like one is nutrition. You eat a lower carb, healthy fat diet. So because of that, your blood sugar is not spiking, insulin is not firing in the same way that a person eating a standard Western, Singaporean or Indian diet is.
Mm-hmm.
That's point one. Point two is you do a lot of low intensity aerobic training, and that also facilitates the development of your fat burning system because there's oxygen available.
Yeah, interestingly, before I came in to do the testing, I used like keto strips to occasionally test my blood ketone level, and I think it was 1.8 before I came here, which is fully in ketosis, which is one of the reasons that the fat burning would be, is an indicator of fat burning being high.
Sure
but, and I think so I've been doing a low carb, high fat diet for pretty much 2 years. And I think the last time we did the testing, I'd been like a few months into it. But Rick, who also did the test, he's not on a low carb diet, but his results were also pretty
That's pretty good as well. Yeah, like he was burning over 60 grams an hour as well for a good chunk of the test. He dropped off earlier than you did in terms of like he didn't burn it for as long. But still, anything over 60 grams is pretty impressive. Like typically we classify people as fat adapted at over 60 grams. So it's not bad. Like if he did do experiment with the lower carb, healthy fat diet, like he could potentially push that up closer to where you are, 70, 80, 90 grams an hour.
Yeah, you were actually pretty surprised that he wasn't on that kind of diet already.
Yeah, I mean, this is typically the profile we see for someone who's eating a lot less carbohydrate than him. But I think it's fair to say too, like, even though he's eating carbohydrate, he's eating a relative, at least based on what he told us, a pretty minimally processed diet. Like, it's not like he's loading up on pizza and pasta and, all this crappy sugar. Like, he's eating a pretty clean diet.
Yeah, and also one thing to note too, based on the results, you can see in comparison to you, like where carbohydrate starts to, get tapped into is at a much lower intensity, naturally because of that, because he's prioritizing it more in his diet. As a result, his body is naturally resorting to relying on it more, albeit it's still secondary. It's not the main fuel source. In his zone, what appeared to be easy zone and steady zone, he was burning through way more, whereas compared to you, I think you didn't even actually start to tap into it until you just
Did they run the
got
same
to your...
protocol?
No, I believe it was slightly different speed. But even at the end of his zone 2 for yourself, you were just tapping into carbohydrate, but it was completely different for Rick, who was well into his zone 1. He was starting to burn some carbohydrate. So put yourself into a race. Typically, even though you're running at a steady effort or riding at a steady effort, for example, he's going to be burning through his stores way quicker than you would be. So of course,
and the benefit of that being, you don't necessarily need to take on any glycogen until, my heart rate, once I'd started burning glycogen, was like 135 or 140.
Yeah, your aerobic zone 2.
Where are you going?
Yeah, so...
138
to 153 beats per minute.
Yeah, it's when the sort of glycogen burning.
So towards the higher end of that, yeah.
And I suppose that leads on to the reason for doing this. It's not necessarily... It's obviously... seeing how efficient you are at burning fat, but then what's the output from this? What do we learn from? What do we take from it and action into moving forward?
Sure. Well, it depends on your goals, right? Because the thing I like so much about this test is it has a very broad application, right? Like it can enhance endurance performance, like what we've just been talking about, but it will give you a more stable supply of energy throughout the day if you become a better fat burner. In a gram of fat, there's 9 calories of energy. In a gram of sugar or carbohydrate, there's 4 calories of energy. So fat has twice as much energy, but because it's not as easy to access, most people don't, and they preference sugar. So if we can turn on your fat burner and make you a fat burner, you're just going to have a far more stable supply of energy throughout the day, which is nice if you have a job and kids and other things. The other benefit is, like you mentioned earlier, once you become a fat burner, it becomes very easy to stay lean. And I'm a pretty good example of that. I'm not super lean, but I don't do very much exercise these days, and I'm only 2 kilos heavier than I was at the Olympic trials. Now, arguably, I've lost a little bit of muscle, but still, the diet helps you to maintain a healthy body composition. And I think at the end of the day, everyone should be focused on health. And to me, byproduct of health is good performance anyway, right? Like one of the best things you can do as an athlete is just be healthy so that you can be consistent.
Yeah, I agree. And typically what this test also helps us highlight is, like I say, it's not just the hour of training you do per day, but it's also outside of that, the other 23 hours. And that's what we typically address. And certainly myself, when I have people come through, do the test, I start to discuss what they're doing, because that's typically why you're in the position you're in. It's not necessarily your training. It's obviously how you're treating your diet and, how you're sleeping, how you're resting and managing stress. And so by highlighting that, bringing that to the forefront and maybe making some adjustments, typically can encourage people to encourage being healthier and also being more fat adapted.
That's a good point. A big mistake a lot of athletes are making is they're thinking that it's just training that makes them better.
Big time,
Training doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like everything you do outside of training impacts your ability to do the training and then absorb it. And just because you're training doesn't actually mean you're benefiting from it very much. And so the testing is cool because it catches when things aren't going well, but it also... it's very, you can see it, it's very graphical, right? And we can show you whether you're getting better, worse, or the same. It's very clear. And that drives confidence as well, right? Because a lot of the things that we say in here are very counterintuitive. We'll make you faster by having you train slower. We'll make you skinnier by having you eat more fat. It's a very hard thing just for me to tell someone that and have them go, oh, yeah, sweet, that makes sense. I'm going to do it. But when we show them and we can prove it to them as well, we don't just say, this is how it is. I can show you. I can't bullshit you. If you come back and it's not better, we can't dance around that. It's clear.
Yeah, it's massively worked for me from the first time coming to see you, and I'd already heard about training at low intensity helps you tap into your fat resources and actually will build your overall aerobic fitness. But that's one thing that I got out of the testing from the first time and from redoing it is understanding what that intensity is. So you suggest doing most of it by heart rate is a best way to do it. But you also talked about overlapping that with how you feel as well.
It's such a funny thing, man, because at the end of the day, everyone, so many coaches, especially in Singapore, I find it really funny. People argue over what's better, pace, heart rate, feel. It doesn't matter, right? What's important, what really matters is the intensity. Yeah. Those are just ways to gauge intensity. Yeah. Now, power is also coming into play. We've used that on the bike for a while, but power is also becoming a measurement, and I'm sure people will start arguing about that. Yeah. But at the end of the day, the intensity of the exercise you do is probably the most important thing because it's what determines the physiological response and your recovery time afterwards, right? Yeah. And so the argument shouldn't be around whether pace is best or heart rate is best or feel is best. It should be around how do I train at the right intensity for me? Right? So step one, do a lactate test, right? A lactate test is a fitness test. The outcome of that is we determine your threshold. And from that, we calculate out training zones. Now, they can be in the form of feel, i.e. run easy, steady, moderately hard, hard. Or they can be in the term of a heart rate zone. Or they can be a pace zone. We preference heart rate here because the people we work with have jobs, social lives, and a lot of other things fighting for their time. And like I said earlier, training doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? There's lots of things that act on it. Your body doesn't know the difference between training stress and work stress. It's all cortisol, it's all fatigue. It can't differentiate. And so if you have a whole bunch of stress coming at you from work, or maybe you're going through a divorce, or you're having financial troubles, and at the same time you're trying to train hard for a marathon, at some point something will give. Now, what's nice about heart rate, and a lot of coaches and athletes don't like this part about it, but I do, is that it responds to everything. It responds to those forms of stress. And when you are in those periods of stress, your output, i.e. your pace, will be down for a while. Likewise, in this environment, it's very hot. That's a huge stress on the body. So you run a bit cooler than you would if you were running in the Gold Coast or something where it's cooler, right? So heart rate self-corrects. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't care about how you feel and you shouldn't care about pace. Of course you should. It's just that we preference heart rate as the main tool for prescribing intensity because it's objective. If I tell people to go run easy, run steady, run hard, I've tried that. It doesn't work well because, as we've seen with the lactate test, most people have a very warped sense of how hard they're working. We'll say on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being easy, 10 being as hard as you can run, how do you feel? I say, I'm a 3. And then we take a finger prick and they're already at threshold. That's a very big disconnect of how they feel and how hard they're actually working. Yeah. And
it's almost much more scientific with high heart rate. You can't, it's less subjective.
It's an objective measurement, but it also responds to these variables. Pace is also really good, right? But the issue that I have with pace is that, again, a bit like VO2 max, I call it a vanity metric, because like pace can lead you down a dark road. Because if you are assigned a pace that you have to run at on any given day, but you've had a really rough day at work or it's extremely hot, your body's under more stress, you push harder than you need to on that day, and then that carries forward, right? And so it doesn't take long before you end up running yourself down a hole. Now, that's not always the case, and I think for some athletes, running to a pace is very useful. In our program, in some of the later stages of it, closer to the race, I just say run at race effort. And what I mean by that is you choose to run to a pace, a heart rate, a feel, whatever you like, but it's your opportunity to dial in what you think is right for you. Because they all have benefit, and this is what I think is getting lost.
It's almost like the diet one, which could be dogmatic. Like this, it's like, no, you have to do it to feel. You have to.
And there's not one right answer. Like what works for one person won't work for the other, and that's true for training. That's true for diet. That's true for everything. And what works for you now won't work for you necessarily in a year's time. And that's part of the fun and part of the frustration is like it's always this moving target that you have to try and adjust. And if you find something that works for you, bloody use it, right? Until it doesn't. But like anything too, I think it's important to understand that, there's not one way to go. There's lots of ways to go, but some are higher risk than others. And so again, like I like heart rate because we're sort of limiting that risk.
And I think everyone just wants the silver bullet, don't they? They just want just tell me exactly what I need to do and how I can get better. And it's not as simple as that. And I think both with diet and with sort of training methodology, you need to see what works for you and go through that trial and error. Exactly.
And that's why the testing is beneficial too, regardless of the method of training you choose. Like this stuff just gives you feedback on any given day of how you're looking and how it's going. And some days it'll be good, some days it's not so good, but it's feedback. Likewise, I'm a big fan of something called a MAF test. I don't know if you've ever done one, but that's an awesome way of tracking aerobic fitness as well, because, again, coming back to things, like you can be doing really good training, but if that MAF test is not improving, that's feedback that there's something else acting on you that's affecting the development of your aerobic system.
And I think it'll be good to explain that actually. So the MAF test is from a guy called Dr. Phil Maffetone.
That's right,
who is an endurance coach, or like he's a scientist as well. Obviously, he's a doctor. So, but the test, and he's actually one of the biggest proponents of like a high fat, low carb diet and low intensity training. Right. So, was he one of the inspirations of you moving into this style of training, or did you get onto him?
No, so it's really funny, man. Like I started, like I said, in 2008, doing testing, this and that. We'd done it for a couple of years. And we'd figured some stuff out. Like we'd figured out, I knew anyway that lower intensity exercise was at the heart of endurance performance, like through my years of racing. But I didn't understand the food piece. And we started figuring out this low carb thing. And we were very early to the game on that front, I think, especially in Singapore. No one here was really talking about that. And I was the odd weirdo in the corner spouting this message. And again, like really just playing with it to figure out how it works. And then I thought I was pretty clever figuring out these things. And then about 2-3 years into it, I stumbled on his book and I read his book and I was like, damn it. If I just read that on day one, it would have saved me 3 years of work. Because basically what he was advocating is very similar to the conclusions that we'd come to, which is you want to become a fat burner. You want to do the bulk of your training at a lower intensity. You want to eat a lower carb, healthy fat diet. You want to get a lot of sleep. And you want to prioritize for health and have performance be a byproduct of that. And
I've heard him on a few podcasts and everything. But the MAF test is a great way to a litmus test of how you're performing on those levels. And the basic of the test is you do a 6 kilometer run at a heart rate zone, like the bottom. Sorry, is it the top of your?
Of your zone one.
Well, so he uses a formula called his 180 formula, where you basically just take 180 minus off your age, and then you up or down based on a few parameters that he sets, right? And you guys can find that by looking on the website. But for the people that have done lactate testing, we just have people do it at their easy ceiling. So if your easy ceiling, for example, is 150, You run, again, it can be 6, 8K, it doesn't really matter. We typically aim for around 40 minutes worth of running at that heart rate. And what you got to do is hold your heart rate even. So if you hold heart rate even, pace over time will decrease as a result of fatigue. Right? And then what we're looking for are two things. One, what's the average pace for the entire run? And two, what's the drop off between your first K speed and your last K speed? And a person who's very aerobically fit, it'll be a very small drop, a matter of seconds. In people who are not so fit, it can be a matter of minutes. And I'll give you one really good example. A few years ago, I was doing a program for Standard Chartered Bank, and we had a few people down at the track, and we decided to do a math test. And there was a British guy there who, if I was to race him, we would have been very similar. At that time, we were both in about 40-minute 10K shape. And we both I ran it as well that day, and so we both did a math test. And for the first K, like he was running at his heart rate, I was running at my heart rate, and we were within a few meters of each other for the first K. By the end of I think we did 6K, I had lapped him twice. So I was 800 meters in front of him.
Wow. And this on the math test, just around a running track?
Just a Klean practice track, round and round and round. I'd lapped him twice, which stands to that. Basically what that tells you is I have a stronger aerobic system than him, even though if we were to race, we're the same. So my argument to him was, dude, we've got to fix your aerobic system. Like if we fix your aerobic system, you're going to be a 35-minute guy, But he's like, nah, I like smashing myself. And I'm like,
so he's doing all of his training at higher intensity, at like lactate threshold or just before it.
Every time he goes and runs, he basically just runs as hard as he can.
Yeah. And actually, so just to touch on that then, the lactate threshold testing, if you could just explain sort of the format of that, and then you mentioned that like getting the heart rate zones is best from the lactate threshold, or is it best to get it from the fuel efficiency, or a combination of the two?
Lactate. We determine the zones from the lactate test, but Jim, explain the process.
Yeah, so you technically can do it from both, though we preference lactate more so. So the test itself, unlike the fuel efficiency, is actually an incremental step test. So you've been through this, you'll know. Each stage is roughly 5 minutes long with a minute rest in between to assess your lactate and how it accumulates from, once again, low to high intensity. So the aim is to build your lactate concentration to threshold, which is defined as 4 millimoles in the blood. It's universal amongst us all. There are many theories around that, but that's the typical gold standard. And once we acquire a lactate above 4, then we can end the test there, and from there determine your zones back from that. As Ben said earlier, that's how we're able to gauge what is easy, steady, moderately hard, and very hard, to then ensure that when you go train and you put it to practice, you're actually way more black and white with how you spend your time, as opposed to what is very common. People will just hit that kind of moral gray area, and they kind of the black hole of zones, which is kind of zone 3, which is moderately hard. So that's the purpose of the test, and we can then make sure that you spend, like I say, your time better.
So the test is run, you'll start at like 9-10 kilometers an hour, and you'll do 5 minutes.
So for yourself, it was 9 for you because you're a fairly fit guy, though for most people, it will vary based on, and we use a 10K timing to kind of give a good gauge as to what is the right start and end speed. But it can vary per person. But the aim is to make sure we get you to go from what is definitely a comfortable pace, where your lactate stays, roughly around baseline, which is defined as 1 millimole, and then gradually allow it to build within a 4 to 6 stage sort of process. So for you, because you're quite a fit guy, 9 kilometers an hour on the treadmill was the start speed for you, and we just went up by 1 kilometer. But others, it can start off at 5, 6, or 7. It really does depend per person.
And so the outcome of that is finding out at the heart rate at which you hit your lactate threshold, which is 4 millimolars in your blood. Then that would dictate your zone. What zone would that dictate? Where your lactate threshold? Zone 4. So that's the start of your zone 4.
Start of zone 4. Ceiling it. Like that's basically where you cross from going primarily aerobic to primarily anaerobic.
Okay. And so I don't know if you've read the book 80-20 Running.
It's on my bookshelf.
Okay.
I have not read it yet.
Okay. And
that's sure... Matt Fitzgerald, right?
That's right, Matt Fitzgerald.
Tongue-tied.
And a lot of that is around, you spend 80% of your training time in your aerobics, so zones 1 to 2, and then 20% in 3 to 4. And is that a philosophy that you effectively...
I mean, we don't break down those ratios, but it's a pretty good ballpark. Yeah.
When
I can't tell you whether our athletes are doing 80% aerobic and 20% anaerobic, but it's probably pretty close. Somewhere in that region.
Yeah, so we structure it ideally to give you a good amount of time spent training aerobically, i.e. with oxygen, so the zone 1 and 2, and then less time, but still advocated, anaerobically, where you hit your zone 4 and, zone 5 hard and sort of very hard effort, just to ensure that you improve your overall tolerance to lactate and make sure you clear it more efficiently.
Okay, and so recommendations to be able to improve both then. So starting with the fuel efficiency, we've talked a little bit around diet and low training, but are there any specific actions people, if they're not on a high fat, low carb diet, but they have a healthy diet?
I'll go first.
So they may be, they're eating real food, but they'll eat a mixture of like rice and vegetables and protein.
Typically what my go-to process to people is just to ask, what do you eat, right? Because a lot of people typically and don't realize that they just have way too much sugar in their diet. And unfortunately, in this day and age, so much hidden sugar. And I'll just say, look,
pretty much say, if you cut 100% of your added sugar from your diet, it's going to do nothing but improve your overall health. There's
an interesting thing, once again, by Dr. Phil Maffletone called, what's the name?
2-week test?
2-week test, that's the one, yeah. So you essentially go 2 whole weeks with 0 sugar in your diet. I went through this process myself when I moved here. Ben was very kind to put me on that to lose a few kg, and it definitely helped. But essentially, you go 2 whole weeks without any sugar. So we're talking no bread, rice, pasta, noodles, fruit, even, granola. There's a long, extensive no list and a very small yes list, but essentially there's 0 sugar. And what that will essentially do is by the end of the 2 weeks, pretty much get you towards, ketogenesis, and then allow your body to just prioritize fat entirely. And I myself, I lost within a 2-week period, I think it was around 8 kilos in body weight, which that wasn't entirely through fat, of course, water weight and so forth.
Yeah, because this is the interesting thing. So you have 3 grams of water or 3 milliliters of water, same thing for every fat molecule, and for every carbohydrate molecule, and it's 1-to-1. So what people often
you're getting
find,
very technical there, but yes,
but so effectively what people see is like an immediate drop in weight.
It
but
plateaus
that's more
off.
Just losing water.
Yeah, so I saw around I think it was about a 5 to 6 kilo loss at the beginning in the first week, and then it slowly plateaued, and it was probably about 1 to 2 more in the second week. But still, just my issue, because my background was basically the opposite to what it is now. I did nothing but high intensity training, powerlifting, weightlifting, strength and conditioning, that all I ever ate was sugar because I had to supplement that. And so my insulin was always high. I never enabled my body to tap into fat. So as a result, I stored a decent amount of it. And so when I took that away and my insulin finally came down, I was then able to metabolize fat and actually lose a significant amount of weight, which definitely helped my running, which I then had to do because I had to do a half marathon.
That was his first,
my first
KPI. He said, if you're coming to work here, we're changing your diet. B, you're going to run a half marathon.
So I had four months to go from barely running 5K, which was scary to me at the point, to then running a half marathon, which, for those of you wondering, was 2.5 hours in Singapore with all the heat and humidity, which I was new to too, right? Because I'd never really ran in that kind of heat. And so, but no, I enjoyed the experience, and of course it got me hooked, right? From that moment on, and I wanted to get better and improve my timings and of course become overall healthier, and that I realized was the main thing for me. I was 10 times fitter than I had ever been, and it's just simply because I had some aerobic fitness, and I was
and so like even if you are having complex carbohydrate, like high GI carbohydrate, like as you said, like things like muesli and stuff, people will still want to eat. Even if they have that, but just cut out any added sugar. We talked about Coke. You haven't had a Coke in 4 years or something.
No, I'm literally like an alcoholic when it comes to Coke. Like this month, September.
And we're talking about the black liquid stuff here.
Not the Coca-Cola. No, Coca-Cola.
Not the
just the state
stuff. The black liquid. So I haven't had any 2 years this month.
Right. Okay. So you're fully on.
And if I have any, that'll be game over. Like I'm a very addictive kind of personality, so I have to be a little bit careful with that stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, so cutting that out, any sort of chocolate or sweet confectionery.
Dark chocolate's all right.
I love dark, but 80%, 85% dark chocolate.
I mean, if you can just move away from all the processed foods, just look for foods that humans haven't interfered with, like fruit and veg, meat and fish, nuts and seeds, eggs. Like organic. Those things don't come in heavily packaged
plastic
things. They don't have a massive ingredient list. They're just food. If they're the foundation of your diet, then if you have a little bit here and there of other things, it's not the end of the world. If you combine that with some good low intensity aerobic training, 8 hours of sleep, and limit stress, like you're going to be in a
and
very, very healthy place.
Yeah, and it's important to touch on too, once again, in this day and age, that access to food, certainly in Singapore, is easy, very easy. I mean, you don't even have to leave your house now. Someone will come on an electric scooter to your door and provide you with your food, right? So you don't even have to actually go out of your way to burn any calories to consume some. So that I highlight to people a lot, which they typically laugh at, because it's true, right? You don't even have to. So, and this is why I believe Singapore, and I don't know if it's still true now, it's actually second in the world for type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
And
Developed
typically
world,
because
I
of
believe.
this, yeah.
Behind America.
Behind America, because they just have, it's a small country. There's a hell of a lot of access to food here, and you don't have to go out of your way to get it. So, and of course, it's very high and refined, sort of carbohydrate. So it's just about assessing what you're, it's just about assessing what you eat.
Yeah.
And typically just picking on the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. What's the easiest thing to remove? I mean, balance is key with everything. We're not saying to have zero sugar in your diet per se. Personally, I recommend just to cycle it in and around your exercise, because that's more or less where you justify.
You earn the right to have some sugar as well. Like if you're a massive dude who's severely overweight, is pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic, then I would argue with that person that they need a dramatic change. And for someone like that, doing a metabolic reset like the 2-week test, or going into a diet like maybe a keto diet or a very low carb diet, is necessary to kickstart the process. Once you're back in a healthier state and you have a good fat burning ability, like you, having whatever is not going to be such a big issue. Like if you're burning 90 grams and we go to McDonald's and you eat a Big Mac and I eat a Big Mac, like you're going to deal with that a lot better than I am. So even though we're eating the same food, the way our body is responding internally is very, very different. But you've earned that right.
Yeah.
So I think people are very short-sighted.
Yeah.
They always think that it's like this forever. But no, like you've got to, you've spent 30 years or whatever putting yourself into this shitty state. You now have to commit at least a few months probably to reset that, move you back towards your factory settings, and to then earn the right to have a bit more free play in what you choose to eat again.
Yeah, and you talking about that, just being able to deliver food right to your door and not have to expend any energy to be able to get it.
Right?
But it's a really interesting analogy, because if you think going back to sort of hunter-gatherer, we'd have to track
complete
our food.
Opposite.
We'd fast for like a day or two because we're tracking food and we're doing low intensity endurance.
Don't even go back that far, mate. Just look at, like when I ask the question for most people, are your grandparents overweight? Most of the time it's no. For sure there's some that are. Yeah. And then I say, well, what about your great-grandparents? And almost always it's no, right? That's not that long ago, right? But what's changed? Well, okay, let's look at the diet point of view. Like a lot of people, like our great-grandparents, were farmers. If they weren't, they were still eating very minimally processed diets. There was no McDonald's, there was no Starbucks, there was no 7-Elevens. There wasn't instant access to this really shitty type of food, right? Yeah. They just ate natural foods, right? Exercise. Did they go to the gym? Did they have a PT? Did they come to a lab like this? No, right?
Manual labor.
But they were active. Yeah. They walked a lot more than we do. They weren't jumping on the travelator along, the road. They weren't going up the escalator. They were walking stairs. They were walking more. They rode bicycles for transport. They played games for fun, right? When you address the stress component, did they have stress? Sure. They had wars and depressions and lots of other stress. But I would argue that without the internet, they were living in a more calm time. And I think the internet, with all the benefits it has brought a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress, right? So wipe that aside. Then we look at sleep. Again, they didn't have TVs so readily available. They didn't have the internet. They couldn't binge watch Netflix. They weren't looking at their phone right until they turned it off to go to sleep, right? And so odds are the quality of their sleep was better. There also wasn't the light pollution that there is now. And so just those 4 simple things meant that they were able to live a far more simple and healthy lifestyle than what most of us are today.
Yeah.
And it's not really any more complicated than that. I don't think that a company like ours needs to exist for health. Like, it's not that hard.
Yeah.
It's just because of the prevalence of all these things, that makes it hard.
Yeah. So I mean, just to sort of recap on the being able to improve your fuel efficiency, diet critical, cutting out all sugar, and lower intensity training. And I think to add to that, actually low intensity training fasted, even if you're not on a high fat, low carb diet, but
definitely.
in the morning training without, like, because the testing we do in the morning is always fasted, isn't it? The testing.
I mean, it's usually just due to simple anatomy for the most part, because a lot of people who eat soon before they exercise, their body's got then two jobs to do. It's trying to redirect blood flow to the stomach and intestines to process whatever food you just had maybe an hour or two before, and then it's also trying to redirect blood flow to the muscle. And so typically you won't expect to be as efficient in that session itself. So of course, then hormonally, insulin levels will likely rise if it typically has any form of refined sugar in. And when you were sedentary at that point, which as a result will put you in a slightly fat-suppressed state, when you then go and train, regardless of the intensity you're training at, you're already in somewhat of a fat-suppressed state. So if you run fasted and you run at an intensity that dictates you to be able to tap into fat, you're going to be in a real good place.
Does it also, if you eat I'm thinking, like, if you eat a banana before you do it, and because you're putting glycogen into your body at the point that does it automatically
blood sugar goes
switch?
up, insulin goes down.
But does that switch so for example, my testing, would it be different if I'd eaten a banana before starting rather than doing it
Typically,
fasted?
yes, though it does depend on the volume of carbohydrate you eat. As we've recently read, that if you're eating anywhere, I think above 200 grams of carbohydrate, then yes, you'll certainly be in a fat suppressed state. But anything around about like the 30 gram or below, which I think a banana would fall within, doesn't necessarily impede your overall ability to burn fat.
And keep in mind, something
training.
like a banana too comes with fiber.
Yeah, so it takes longer to process, so it won't instantly spike your blood sugar levels, which probably wouldn't.
Again, like, I believe that if you ate a banana and we put you on here, you would see a change. It might not be dramatic, but you would see a change for sure. And maybe not to the fat burning, but potentially you'd see sugar coming up earlier.
Yeah. Okay, great. And so secondly, when it comes to the lactate threshold, what are the best ways to be able to improve your lactate threshold?
Well, there's two things, right? Like, first thing is you want to improve your clearance. Like, zone 2 is the magic zone for endurance training. I think most people want to do the bulk of their training there. And then some stuff just at threshold or just below threshold is going to help to push that up. But again, I don't think you need to do that in the short term. I think people need to structure their races into or their year into training cycles and build them around sort of 2 to 3 really key races with a number of other races sort of plugged into that training cycle as part of the preparation. And then that training should be progressive. So you sort of layer it as you build out your fitness, your fat burning, and things like that.
Yeah, and to touch on that, the reason why we advocate zone 2 is typically because of the type of muscle fiber you're incorporating under that sort of intensity, because there's different types of muscle fibers within our muscles, slow twitch and fast twitch. When you're around lactate threshold, you typically incorporate more fast twitch fibers to assist with the stress and the process. Though that, the issue with that is typically you're not able to, you produce quite a lot of lactate through using those fibers. It's only when you go to zone 1 and 2 primarily, you incorporate more slow twitch. They're actually where you can clear lactate better, and it's the slow twitch fibers that are going to be doing that for you. So if you can prioritize a bulk of your training there, as Ben was saying, you can really encourage lactate clearance to improve.
Yeah, interesting. So actually doing like high intensity training, so like doing your fartlek or doing your hill sprints, or won't necessarily improve your lactate threshold.
No, it definitely can, for sure. But again, it's a timing thing. I don't think that's the kind of stuff you need to be doing all the time, because it's very high stress, and the more high intensity you do, the slower it will take to properly develop your aerobic system. So again, that's what I'm talking about when we structure a training around a training cycle. Sort of lay down this aerobic foundation, which also gives you the ability to recover more quickly from those types of sessions. Your body learns speed really quick. Like a few weeks of high intensity stuff, and you'll really benefit from it if you have a foundation. So I always say the analogy is like this: like, you don't, if you want to build a house, you don't go buy all the furniture and buy all the paint and the light fittings and stuff like that, because you got nothing to do with it yet, right? First, you got to put down the floor, you got to build the walls, put in the plumbing, do the electricity. You got to lay that stuff first. That's the low intensity stuff. That's what that gives you. That's the foundation. And then once that is in place and you've built that engine, then you benefit tremendously from doing the high intensity stuff, which are the light fittings, the paint, the furniture, all the
Yeah.
the nice looking
So
stuff.
it's definitely good, just in a concentrated
You need everything.
manner.
It's just you have to time it properly.
not outweigh it.
Yeah, and I suppose that moves quite nicely on to, you've obviously got coaching business as well as the testing. How many athletes do you actually coach?
That's a good question. In the hundreds?
Okay.
Yeah, I don't actually know. I haven't looked for a while, but low to mid hundreds.
Yeah, mixture of runners and triathletes.
Yeah, mixture of runners and triathletes
Some
on
ultras,
our
some
program.
Spartan athletes,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So not just all typically endurance based. There's some Spartan athletes in there, which we've recently come to work with too. So it's a good hybrid there, which is good.
OCR is definitely
pretty
blowing
popular.
up. We've had a couple of people on the podcast that are racers.
Nice.
And so, what does a typical what does a typical training program look like for? I mean, with an ultra runner, for example, someone training for a 100-mile race. Like, how would you look at?
To be fair, we don't work with a whole lot of ultra guys. Like we have probably maybe 20 people, 30 people running ultras. Okay. Most of them are going to maybe about 100K.
Yeah.
Not many of them, just a couple of them are doing 100 milers and stuff. So that's not really our target focus. We tend to work more with like triathletes,
sure.
Ironman triathletes, half Ironman triathletes, and marathoners. We have the bulk of our membership are through marathon runners.
Okay, so let's take that then. So let's take like someone that's like say an hour 40, hour 50 half marathon runner, and they want to take on a 3:30 marathon, say, or something.
First step is I try and talk them out of having time goals, because I just don't think they add any value.
Yeah.
I think people get too worried about the outcome when they should really be focused on the things that are going to lead to the outcome.
See, this is the thing that I've never run a marathon before, and it's partly because of that, because everyone, so when you say, I do long distance running, whatever, they're like, oh, what's your marathon time? Because that is a direct indication of performance. And
it's really interesting, mate, because when I moved to my last coach, one of the first things he drilled into me, I came to him and I'm like, you need to get me into the Olympic trials. I need to win, get more top 10 so I win some more money. It was all outcome. And he said, mate, none of that stuff matters. Those things are byproducts of our process.
Yeah.
So the process is how you train, how you eat, how you recover. Those are the things that are going to drive performance. Looking at an outcome is like a rugby player standing on the field while the game is running and looking at the scoreboard.
Yeah.
There's no value in that, right? And so we've got to pay attention to the process. And the fun thing about that too, Scott, is it takes the pressure off you. So for me, when I stopped worrying about those outcomes, I just started enjoying my training again.
Yeah.
Because it didn't matter. If I had a bad session, it's like, oh, well, I had a bad session. I'll have a better one tomorrow.
I love about running to heart rate. I do all my training low heart rate, and you post it to Strava, and people are immediately looking, how fast was that? It kind of it puts this caveat of I wasn't training for speed here. I was training at my zone 2 level just for increasing aerobic fitness.
Yeah. So that's the first thing though. I try and move a person's mindset away from the outcome, because often they're limiting too. I've seen people come in with a goal of running 3:30, and then because that's their goal, that's what they run. When I really think they could have run significantly better.
Yeah.
So it's quite funny. It's a bit like the Instagram guys. I heard that guys hold Instagram for $1 billion. It was probably worth a hell of a lot more, but because they wanted $1 billion company, that's what they sold for. Don't know if that's true or not, but I did hear that.
Your the boundaries of what you can achieve.
So my take is let that stuff take care of itself. Let's put your focus on the things that matter. Let's improve the quality of your training. And we do that by giving each person a training program and helping them structure their year. Our training programs essentially go through 3 phases. We lay down a base, which is focused on just getting in the habit of training, laying down that aerobic foundation, building out your fat burning, improving your technique, that type of thing. From there, we start to put a strength component into it. So strength training in the form of actual strength exercises, but also lots of hills. We do things like strength sets where we have people doing strength training within a run. And that's something we've tested in the lab, and it actually works quite well.
Strength training within a run? So
so for example,
some pull-ups or push-ups?
Not like that. Kind of like that, but with the legs. So the idea is if I send someone out for a run for an hour, for example, and I tell them every 10 minutes do 30 seconds of squats, that hour run, even though it's an hour, and even though you might only cover 8K, feels like you ran a lot more because your legs are knackered from doing all the exercise and then having to continue to run on them. So there's lots of ways that we can simulate the later stages of a race without having to put someone at the 30K mark.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one way. And so that we do the strength component. And then as the race day gets closer, we do the race specific stuff. So, for the marathoners, a lot more tempo and more zone 3 type of training in the form of tempo intervals, extended tempo running, and then a little bit of high end hard running to really, bring up that fitness in the last few weeks. But it just depends, everyone's different, and that's kind of the structure that we have for pretty much every program. The ultra guys I also have on a marathon plan as a base, but what I've been doing with them is throughout the program, depending on the length of time and the demands of the race, we do what I call big weekends. So we'll structure some like pretty massive weekends depending on exactly what they're doing, where you might do like 3 or 4 hours on a Friday, 5 or 6 hours on a Saturday, 4 hours on a Sunday, to really sort of not only physically smash you, but mentally wear you out as well.
Yeah.
Because an
That's
ultra,
really
you have to be strong to do an ultra, but the fitness you need to do an ultra versus a marathon, in my opinion, is not that dramatically different.
Yeah.
Where I think you have to be very good in an ultra is you have to be a hard bastard. Because at some point it's going to get hard. You're not going to want to run anymore, and you have to have a strong why and be mentally capable of pushing on.
Yeah.
That's the very reason I've never done one.
You're holding the intensity that you do in like a 70.3 for. Have you done a 70? Sorry, you were just Olympic distance.
I was a short course guy, so I just did the Olympic distance draft league. I did one 70.3 distance training with some friends, which I knocked out pretty quick actually.
Yeah.
But no, I never did. I'm considering doing one in the next couple of years, maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about for ultras doing consecutive days though. That's actually rather than doing. I was supposed to be going to Borneo this weekend to do TMBT as a training session, which was 109k. But actually, you'd probably be better off doing 40-40-20 in 3 days as like a consecutive
well, it's always
days
like
training.
whenever you run anything that's very, very long, like you're putting a lot of stress on your body. Like look at Eliud Kipchoge, right? Like he's probably running a marathon a day, right? In terms of volume, if you look at his total volume across the week, but he's not literally running a marathon at a time.
Yeah.
He's breaking that down into at least 2 sessions in a day, right? And what that does is it changes the load recovery balance, and it improves the quality of each of the individual runs, right? Because he recovers a bit in between. It also lowers his chance of getting hurt. So I could put someone on a ultra program and just have them run really long every day. But again, like for most people who have a job and kids and things like that, it's just not a very fun way to prepare for a race. So rather give them a base level of fitness with a typical marathon training program. The benefit of that too is they can still do the high intensity stuff and the tempo stuff, so they still have some leg speed. And then just at really carefully timed places, we inject these bigger weekends, which they vary quite a bit actually depending on the type of ultra, because I mean, as you know, an ultra is anything over 42k, so the distance varies greatly, but so does the terrain, so does the elevation and altitude. So
how do you normally do you use Training Peaks as a program, or how do you track your athletes?
So we have our own custom platform, so we build our own. I'm in the process of redoing it actually. It's a nightmare. But we have our own platform. So I no longer write training programs. It's all automated through algorithms that we've written based on test results. So I can generate a program to what I consider to be about 95% of what I could probably write you from a quality point of view. And then instead of me having to spend an hour doing that, I have an hour free to then support it. So I can make tweaks to it manually. I can answer your questions. I can write blog posts. I can sit here and talk to you. I've got time to spend on the actual coaching. And that's how we're trying to prioritize. Like I really want to use technology to automate as much of the things that I can automate at a high level, so that I have the time available to actually do the things where I think people need personal help.
And give the advice around it.
Because you're very limited by what you can do if you're always writing training programs one-on-one. And so what most coaches do is they either have a template or they have a library and they're just dragging it in. And so again, like that can be quite good, but I think we've done quite a good job at making a very personalized program through the use of technology.
Excellent. I'm going to run through a few quick fire questions to finish then, gents.
Sure, man.
Sounds good.
I'd like to hear any of books that you found inspirational to either your careers or just in general.
Okay, so I'll start?
Yeah.
So there's a couple of books I've read lately. One, I'll start with the sleep one. So I'm reading a book at the moment. I'm not finished. It's called Why We Sleep.
Dr. Matthew Walker, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. It's terrifying. Like, I just think everybody should read that book. Like, I know sleep is important. I see how sleep affects your fat metabolism, and I know how it affects me as an individual. I'm an 8-hour sleep guy, otherwise I'm hopeless. But it's literally terrifying. Like I read last night in this book, if you have 10 consecutive days of sleeping only, he says only 7 hours, you're as impaired as you would be had you not slept for 24 hours. Like that's pretty crazy, right? And, you know, another stat that I heard on one of his podcasts, and I may misquote this, but I think he said that the athlete who gets 6 hours of sleep is 70% more likely to get injured than the athlete who gets 7 hours of sleep.
Interesting.
Like, again, that's pretty dramatic. And so I think that's a good book for everyone to read. I think we're short-circuiting sleep in society these days. People just don't preference it for whatever reason. And I think that's a very, very big mistake.
You talked about stress and cortisol, and actually the lack of sleep is one of the biggest sort of causes of that to go
sleep,
up.
Man, is like, honestly, like one of the number one performance enhancers. Like a lot of people just really don't rank it high enough on their priority list. And, you know, it regulates everything, and it really regulates sleep too. So just as Ben said, 1 hour more can really transform how you wake up and how you go about your day. And kind of stress and sleep, they interlink, right? If you wake up with lack of sleep, you're typically more stressed, and vice versa. If you go to bed kind of more stressed, you typically don't get enough sleep. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg thing, right? So where you break that is kind of hard to figure out. Typically though, it's usually if you just get a good 8 hours sleep a night, you'll find that you'll be able to take on the day better and minimize stress. And of course, stress too comes in many forms. There's mental, emotional stress, which is obviously what we all deal with throughout the day. But then there's obviously physical stress, which is of course exercise, right? And so how you cope with that is once again very different per person, quite unique. Easier from a physical standpoint, you know, sleep is of course right up there. But obviously foam rolling, myofascial release and all that can typically help. But yeah, sleep is definitely real important. Very good. Any books you're reading at the moment, Jim? Or well, I'll be honest, I'm a podcast guy myself, but the
millennials.
Yeah, and I'm a millennial. So Mark Manson's books, I'm kind of hooked on a little bit. So I read both of his books now. I don't know if you know who Mark Manson is.
It's good.
I think he was a worldwide bestseller. So you should probably you'll find his book if you go to any
Subtle Art
store.
of Not Giving a Fuck.
So that's the first one.
Everything is fucked. A book about hope.
What's the other one?
Everything is fucked. A book about hope. So he's really upfront and honest about it. But it's really cool how he comes about it. You know, when it comes to, in fact, I think I read through his first book in about 2 days on the commutes to work and stuff. I was just reading through chapter to chapter. I mean, and they're not big, but he really just comes across in a different way than most people. He's really easy to read, and he just says it how it is, you know, and it kind of makes you reassess things, and once again makes you question why you typically give a fuck about things in life, right? And just kind of
I guess it feeds into that stress thing as well,
big time. Like he just addresses how like we typically just stress over the stupidest of things, and how we really should just kind of reassess and just live a happier life to some extent. So that's typically why I read. But like I say, I'm a millennial, so I don't read many books.
Podcast then, you mentioned you're more of a
well, actually, I like I typically, even though they don't upload regularly, I like the Nike podcast. It's actually through Spotify. I listen to that every now and then because they have people like Matt Fraser on, who's a CrossFit athlete. You know, I like to typically get a listen in on their insights as to how they train. They offer a good insight into sleep too and stuff. I think they had Ariana Huffington on there as well. So they have some real cool people who come on, but it's all sport related, right? And they really advocate sleep, and they have specialists come on who talk about that. But you know, I also typically like Gary Vee, but you know, he's nothing to do with what we're talking about here. He's just or an entrepreneur. I mean, he's like a black and white kind of personality. I know Ben's not overly keen. Kind of but I mean, I like how he's kind of just upfront and honest too, and he says it how it is, and you know, he's not, you know, he doesn't beat around the bush, right?
I mean, he was one of the inspirations of us starting this podcast.
Oh, really?
Right?
Nice.
And
because he does everything, right?
And it's
his podcast is good.
Just to have an idea, just follow through with it rather than. And I think the first time we met, I talked about wanting to get you on the podcast. It's like 2 years later, but we're here now anyway. Ben, do you listen to podcasts at all, Ben? Or?
Oh, every day, man. Yeah, I love them as well. Yeah, anytime I'm commuting or driving on a train. I'm listening to something.
What's your go-to?
But good question. Well, I tend to dive down rabbit holes. So if I get interested in a person, like I would just search them and I will listen to everything. So like I've been
This
through a
Matthew
Peter
Walker
Attia
one.
affair. I've been through Matthew Walker. I'm listening to a guy called Jason Fried at the moment. I've been listening to every podcast he's ever been on. He founded a company called Basecamp, and he's basically speaking out against Silicon Valley and how you don't need to raise money and you don't need to work 80-hour weeks and yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
So it's not really aligned with...
I've heard it's like a project management software, isn't it?
Yeah, he runs a company called Basecamp, exactly. But I tend to agree with that philosophy because one of the challenges that I have in my work is like stress, right? People have stress that dramatically affects performance. Yeah. And so part of what I want to do with our program, and we're writing a whole bunch of content for this for our new platform, is to help people work better as well and to prioritize and to focus better so that when they go to work, they actually get shit done. Yeah. And then they go home, they have time to actually do their training, spend time with their kids and have their family life to really get more. Because so many people are just in meetings and answering WhatsApp and just doing like on social media and just not at all present and just wasting their time, in my opinion. So part of the coach philosophy is about, we're quite holistic. And so I'm always looking for ways to sort of help people with that side of things as well.
That's really interesting. I mean, having that harmony between work, family, and in your training and overall health and well-being. And we talked about it a bit on the podcast before. I consider it like a bit like a tripod, right? There's sometimes that certain parts can dip down, but you need to keep it in some degree of balance for it to stay up.
Right? Yeah, and I think in life you have phases, right? Like, when you're younger, you tend to have more career focus. You don't have kids yet, and you can focus more on career. Then in your 30s, you tend to have kids and whatnot, and the focus goes a bit more on family, and then things change, and I think that's fine. But I tend to agree, like, you have to have a certain level of balance, otherwise you're just going to crash and burn, or you're not going to be very happy. And that's the sad thing, right? We have one life. Like, shouldn't we all try and do work we like with people we like and live a relatively happy life?
Yeah.
I mean, that's my motivation.
And this is the thing I try and do is, with all of those things in play, I try and combine, like my commute is my exercise. Like I run to work every day or run back, and so try and cram
that's
that
why
in.
You're such a sweaty bastard when you got here.
But is that something you advise when you're coaching people about how to like fit it in around
whatever
their
works.
days?
Like, because this is the thing, like everyone's different, right? And this is the one thing that's hard about my job is kind of reverse engineering them. And if that is something that works and you're happy to do it, then go all in on it. But I could have someone else come in and say the same thing and they're like, no chance. I can't do that, right? So
don't have a shower in the office.
Just work with what best, right? But just don't go, over stressing yourself to try and make something like that fit in if it just doesn't work. So trial and error.
At the end of the day, man, I always say you don't get fat by going to McDonald's once, right? Like, you are what you repeatedly do. So long as you're showing up relatively consistently and doing your best, like over a long period, you're going to have a pretty good outcome, right? I think people get caught up in this instant gratification, phone mentality where everything is instant, right? Yeah. And they forget that actual meaningful progress takes time, right? You don't become the CEO of a company straight out of school, or rarely. You don't just meet your wife on the day you want to meet her. Yeah. You don't win an Olympic medal without a whole bunch of prep, right? And people forget that now with Amazon shipping daily and Netflix binge watching and all these things. And I think it's really quite a problem. So again, we're always trying to pull people back and say, hey, slow down, be more meaningful in what you're doing, optimize to not just training, but your nutrition, your lifestyle, how you choose to work. Like, I'm always trying to play with things like that to see how we can become better as a company as well, how we can become more efficient, and then how we can teach people through our programs to do the same things that we're doing. And are we awesome at it? No, man. Like, we're a work in progress, right? But you got to try. I
really like that. Meaningful progress comes a day at a time. Like it's the instant gratification in this world is a stress adder. It's like people want stuff too instantaneously.
It's just everyone's anxious. Everyone's always anxious, and they're just doing too much. Like, you just got to get good at saying no. Like, there's a quote that cycles in my head now. Like, I think it was Tim Ferriss. He said, "You have to be okay with small bad things happening." And it's true. Like, in my experience, like, I deleted Facebook. I don't use Facebook anymore. Instagram, I only check occasionally on my computer. I'm toying with the idea of getting email and WhatsApp off my phone. I haven't had the balls to do it yet, but I can see it coming in the next year or so. But those things, they just make you calmer.
Yeah.
Like, you just don't need to know what's going on. I'm getting analog again. I'm thinking of getting a newspaper subscription. Like, I'm thinking of really just dialing it down, because the more I simplify my life and the less connected I am, the more calm and happy I feel, and the better father I am. And I just think it's better. Now, it's funny that I say that, because I run I don't know if I call it a tech company, but the technology side of what I do is very important. But I think these things are tools, just like a heart rate monitor, right? You don't have to be a slave, and they should work in your best interest. They shouldn't be suckering you in to steal your life for advertising dollars and things like that. And so I think people just need to be more mindful of this and need to make smarter choices.
Yeah. Amen. Okay, and best kit you've bought for under $100?
Oh, good question.
Or under $100.
What do you classify as kit? Actually, I would give a shout out for this, because this thing has been awesome.
Go, what is it?
It's just a Klean Kanteen, but it's insulated. And so, like, it keeps my cup of tea warm for bloody hours.
Right.
On the flip side, when I'm going to a training session or whatever, you throw some ice in there and it keeps it cold for literally days, I think.
Klean Kanteen.
Yeah,
bottle.
it's just really good.
Okay.
And it's,
Yeah.
it was $40 or something. It was money well spent.
No.
So I don't know if that classifies as kit,
absolutely.
but it's probably like
Yeah,
the only thing that comes to mind,
I thought
actually.
you were going to, after talking about heart monitors before, I thought you were going to say a heart
Well, I mean, okay, so on that note, if I'm talking to a client or an athlete that I'm coaching, there's two pieces of kit that I think everyone should own. One is a heart rate monitor. And it doesn't have to be a fancy one like this. It can just be a basic one you get from Decathlon. The second thing is a foam roller. I think those two things, like, they just give you a very good return on the money you spend on them. And I think, again, a lot of people are just getting hung up on shit that doesn't matter. Like, they worry about, these fancy recovery boots and these fancy bikes and this and that. Like, it's still the engine, right? Yeah. Those things can come later, Like, people ask me about altitude training. Should I be altitude training? I'm like, well, you can't run a 50-minute 10K. Like, let's get the basics right. And you've only been training for 3 months. Let's get the basics right. Let's lay down a bit of a foundation, and then, maybe we consider some IHT or something like that. But, like, walk before you can run.
Yeah, it's great advice. I've got 2 foam rollers, and it's one of the things that
It's a love-hate relationship.
love-hate,
but I can just never fit it into my day. Like,
That's your brain, because it hurts. You're thinking, no, I don't want to do it. I don't want the pain.
Forcing yourself to do it.
Yeah.
And it's self-inflicting pain rather than getting a massage where it's someone else inflicting it on you.
Yeah, I mean, if you have the means to go get a massage, get a massage. Like, that would be my preference too, because I have this love-hate thing with a foam roller. I hate rolling on them, but they kept me
serve a purpose.
in decent condition when I was an athlete to be able to perform.
Yeah, and I mean, there's these massage guns now too, right? Albeit it's not under $100. I think they're about
they're
$250.
pretty punchy,
but if you can afford one and justify it, they're, once again, if you use it right, can be quite useful too. So that's always good. I'm racking my brain as to what mine would be for under $100. Though, if I was to make it, sport related, in my last half marathon, I ran with a Camelback on. And that was a real last-ditch decision, because I had never ran with one before, and I have to admit,
heavy enough?
Well, no, it was a kilo, so that's nothing to me, right? Like, I'm just a short and stocky guy. So, but no, running with that actually made my life 10 times easier in the race itself. Just not having to stop, keep a rhythm, hydrate with all the salt I needed, and it was just way more feasible with that. And maybe a blender, actually. Like, now I'm thinking of it, like, having a blender at home is real practical for me, just because when it comes to eating right in the morning, it's so simple to do. Just throw in the ingredients you need, blend it up, and take it to work.
Well, my blender didn't cost under $100, that's for sure.
Yeah, I've got a NutriBullet one. I'm pretty sure
Okay.
it's more than that, but you can get.
Well, I mean, as long as it blends, right? Like, it doesn't need to be fancy. Once again,
so what do you go for? Like smoothies, frozen berries?
Yeah, so
protein shake?
to be honest, it typically, like I say, it depends on what I have throughout the day. Like, let's say I've got a morning run, then typically what I have afterwards will have some form of like carbohydrate in. I guess this ties back into what we've been saying, but it's fruit related, right? So berries are great because they're high in antioxidants to help counteract inflammation. So blueberries are the common go-to for me. But I typically have frozen banana, cut that up and have that in the freezer so I can just plonk a couple cubes in. And then, of course, protein powder. Half an avocado is always good, makes it nice and creamy. And, of course, just water. Yeah, I try to avoid any other unnecessary sugar. Just try to keep it fruit-based. Milk, I do try to avoid, actually, because you'll find there's a lot of hidden sugar in there that I don't necessarily need. But, no, I think a blend is real practical because it just takes a lot of, all the angst out of getting up and trying to plan what you need to eat sometimes. And you can still get what you need.
Yeah, I think back to your about minimizing stress. One thing I like about having a pretty regimented diet is because it takes the thinking out of it. It's like I pretty much eat salads for breakfast and dinner.
As long as you can hack it.
Mate,
Yeah.
I am all about taking the thinking out of everything. Like,
Yeah.
I wear the same clothes every day.
Well,
I
variations of the same clothes. You don't wear the exact
Yeah,
same
no,
stuff
no,
every
I
day.
do wash them.
Yeah.
you know, like, any decision I can automate through system, like, I will do that.
Yeah.
Because
Minimalistic,
there's a concept known as decision fatigue, and
You waste so much energy
I
deciding.
truly believe in it. So anything you can do to make fewer decisions, I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
Closing question, gents. So I really like to ask this around things you're most proud of, both professionally and personally. What was your proudest personal and professional moment?
I got to tell you, I'm pretty proud of my kids. I got 3-year-old twins, so they keep me pretty busy. And every day, like, I'm just blown away by what they do. Like, last week, my boy did a tumble turn in the pool, which I thought was pretty rad because I couldn't do a flip turn when I was 3. Yeah. So that made me pretty proud. And then my girls just started her ballet classes, and you see her and they're trying her best. And, you know, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's a great age as well. And professionally?
Professionally, honestly, like, my proudest thing about what I've done professionally is probably that I've played by my own rules. Like, I've never had a job. Like, I came out of high school, I started racing. I raced because that's what I wanted to do. I was fortunate that some companies got behind me and supported me on that journey. I then came to Singapore because I wanted to come to Singapore. I started the company. It's been hard, but I think I've made a difference in to some people here, and I've been able to do something that I love with people that I love, and I think that's been pretty awesome. So I think that's probably what I'm proudest of professionally. Yeah.
You've definitely done here in Singapore. You've really changed the way a lot of endurance athletes here think about training, and you've made a big impact on the sport.
Thanks, mate. I appreciate that.
Good to know.
Great job. Yeah, and Jim, for you, sir.
Oh, well, you know what? Like, professionally, I would have to. I'm still early days, right? Like, I'm not that old, being 24 years of age, so I've got many years to come. So, you know what? The fact that I'm actually putting my degree to use is, of course, one of those. right?
Yeah, that's few and far between.
A lot of you'd be surprised. A lot of people typically go into do a degree and they don't actually end up getting a job in that same profession, right? And so the fact that I'm able to do that in a country I'd never thought I'd actually be living in and working for such a great company is probably one of the greatest achievements thus far.
Yeah, that's amazing. And personally?
Personally, oh God, you know what? That's kind of hard too. I'd say when I was growing up through my early teens, I was very involved in, like I say, individual sports, and motorsport was my main focus. Having my father at the point, being a mechanic himself and knowing everything about cars, we'd be typically racing nationally around the UK, and entering national championships and typically winning those, not on a braggy basis, but being able to compete with teams that had tenfold the amount of funding, and have them come up and ask what our setup is and kind of find out why we were doing so good was probably one of my proudest moments. The fact that we could
a car in Singapore?
No, definitely not. No, it's different in the UK for sure. But no, I was racing guys twice my age sometimes. They're in their high 20s.
Wow.
I was 16 at this time, and we were just funding ourselves. He knew everything about cars, being 50 plus years of age with the amount of experience he had. But yeah, we were able to compete quite seriously with these teams, and having them come over and kind of find out what we were about was always quite a good moment for us, because we were really quite competitive, which was always kind of my proudest moment, I'd say.
Someone said to me the other day, what do you think is the fittest athletes or sport? And someone actually mentioned motorsport, and I was like, no. Give me a Tour de France cyclist any day of the week.
Well, here's the thing, Jenson Button, for example, ironically, actually, he grew up in the same town I did. He went to the same schools, and he's obviously an ex-professional, Formula One driver, world champion, and so forth. He's actually a very good triathlete. Yeah. So,
really?
But the fitness level these guys need is, because it's insane, right? They're putting themselves through. It's essentially like a fighter pilot, right? They have so much G-force to sustain for a long period of time. It requires a lot of energy, and so these guys have to be lean and mean and be able to put this car through the paces for an extended period of time. They dehydrate significantly. I mean, they come into Singapore soon, right?
Yeah.
The heat and humidity here is crazy. Imagine being sat in a cockpit whilst trying to sustain that and fight this, sort of G-force you have to go through. So it's you have to be seriously fit. And when I did that, actually, ironically, I didn't tell Ben this, but I actually did do a decent amount of, aerobic-based training before I found the weights in the weight room, right? So, but no, one of those, I wouldn't say they're the fittest, that's for sure, but they're definitely up there. You have to have a respectable amount of fitness.
What would you say were the fittest athletes in the world?
I don't know, man. That's a hard question. I sort of
Yeah.
when you ask me that, my initial reaction is like yours. It's cyclists.
Define
That
fittest.
sport is crazy. But then
This
that's
is
the
the
thing.
thing.
Like, then next comes to mind is something like cross-country skiing,
Yeah.
or something like that. Like, that's not a sport I'm at all familiar with. I spent my life chasing summer. But I believe they have some of the highest VO2 maxes on the planet.
They're well known as having them. Yeah,
You know,
and they
they're
can
spending a
cross
lot of
over
time at
into-
altitude. They train Killian Jornet. Like, he's probably a good example of someone who'd be
Yeah.
crazy fit.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a good
reading
question.
the Endure book, and yeah, they talk about cross-country skiing as being one of the endurance bases. We talked briefly about it, but CrossFit and OCR.
Yeah,
I think is all-round athletes, they're probably the best.
Yeah.
And when you think about anaerobic.
Yeah, that's
I
what
think
came to my
OCR
mind.
for sure. CrossFit guys, they're going to be far more heavily weighted on the anaerobic.
Wow.
Well, you
I
say
see,
that.
yeah.
You see that CrossFit has evolved over the years. Initially,
Yeah, true,
when
I'm
it came in, now it's definitely they're throwing in some real
They do like
spanners in the works.
half marathon runs.
Yeah,
Oh, they
like
do?
hikes,
Okay,
they're
then
doing
I'm just
serious.
ignorant then.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
that's not my...
Yeah, like for example, like
Okay, then
say
that'll be
Matt
fair.
Fraser, for example, like he's one of those most elite now, right? He's now
Yeah.
4-time, I think, CrossFit champion. But what they go through is, in my opinion, definitely probably all-round fitness. I'd say with strength, power, aerobic, and anaerobic, it's real. Yeah, they're up there, that's for sure.
I'll give a shout out to triathletes as well, though. Triathletes are fit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just no strength. In
No.
comparison.
Because
No, I would argue that, man. They're pretty strong triathletes.
Okay.
Yeah, but the one I'm amazed by are mixed martial artists. They are, I believe,
BJJ
some of the
and
best
that
out
type of
there.
definitely, yeah, I agree.
Just the type of so Muay Thai from Jiu-Jitsu, but they have to do a lot of aerobic training around it as well, and
Yeah.
to sustain for 15 to 25 minutes that level of intensity.
There was this really cool show a long time ago now in New Zealand called Clash of the Codes, where they basically get all the people from like rowers, triathletes, like mixed martial artists, cyclists, like just people from all the different codes of sports, and pull them together to do all these different types of races. Super interesting. It's been
Yeah.
fun. And the triathletes actually did probably, I think they won most consistently because they were so diverse.
Yeah.
And this was back before obstacle course racing was a thing and stuff like that. But, you know, it'd be interesting to throw them in the mix and see how that changed the dynamic. But that was a cool show.
Maybe we should start it in Singapore. I
Man,
like to,
that would be
yeah, yeah. Excellent, gents. Look, appreciate the time and fascinating, really, really fascinating to understand everything that we can do to help improve our overall aerobic ability. Look forward to getting you guys on again in the future. But yeah, with that, thanks for joining.
You
Yeah,
bet. Thanks,
thank you.
Scott.
The Endurance Asia podcast.
And always tell a truthful story if they ever ask. Stop the complaining cause things ain't that bad.